Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. All right, ladies and gents, welcome back to another episode of Blue Grit Radio. This is your host, Eric, and today I'm joined by a friend, by a colleague, Sam Steiner. Sam is an active law enforcement officer. I've worked with him for a number of years. I worked with him, and then I didn't work with him, and then came back, as sometimes they do. But I'm really excited to share Sam and his story and his outlook with so many of you for numerous reasons. He's a cop's cop, and he does stuff the right way. He does it in a very professional, productive, compassionate way that garners the respect of not just line officers, but his bosses and my bosses. And I think that it's very important for me to recognize and share that, because a lot of times, we can get really in on our little silos, and Sam's just such a positive dude, and his outlook and passion is so infectious that I was really excited, as I've known him for so long and gotten to even just know him more, through the years, that he was open and willing to come on this and talk about his experiences, his background, and, his why, but also, some lessons learned and important things to think about and share about with first responder resilience. So without further ado, Sam, thanks for coming on the show, man.
Thank you. It was quite an intro. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah,
I appreciate you having me and thinking of me.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Good.
I have thoughts, man, but that's not scripted. It's easy to say some really positive things about you because I really just respect the crap out of you. So
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, man. So, we talked a little bit about coming on the show. We talked about things that we'd probably talk about. And I appreciate your open bookness and just wanting to be a resource and helpful to others, because your story is very unique.
Sure.
However, there are things that a lot of us, myself included, I recognize will resonate with things and themes. So, yeah,
Sure.
man, I just kind of want to turn it to you, and please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So, I've listened to a lot of cops that we know talk about their background and stuff. And I found a real big commonality among a bunch of us is that a lot of us had pretty traumatic upbringings, and traumatic stuff happened to us as we're growing up. There are officers who had, would describe their lives as sheltered. But I also think it's important to talk about, people that have bad things happen to them growing up and why those people got involved in law enforcement. So I'm willing to talk a little bit about that, I guess. So I would describe I'll also talk about why that led me to law enforcement and why I think that's unique. So I would say that my childhood was chaotic through most of it. My parents met, it was years before I was born. My dad was a traveling musician and my mom was a waitress at a bar in Seattle. And from my understanding, the foundation of their relationship was partying. That was how it was described to me by them. Both of them, had some substance use issues, specifically alcohol was the big thing. My mom got pregnant with me before they got married, and they got married because she was pregnant with me, I think. I was born, back up a little bit. My mom had some severe health issues when I was born. She smoked a lot and had hepatitis C. And because of that, I was born about 2 months prematurely. Already kind of a recipe for, needing extra support when you're really young. My brother was born about 19 months after I was, and my mom got pretty sick with hepatitis C right around that time. She ended up going on an experimental drug to treat hepatitis C that created some pretty bad mood swings for her. And she became pretty unpredictable during that time. at least from my perspective of being 3 or 4 years old. And those are some of my early memories. She ended up getting a little bit better from that. And she ended up actually getting sober. Prior to that time, she would drink herself to sleep every night. She ended up getting sober and wanted my dad to stop drinking, and they weren't on the same page about that. And so that created a lot of fighting and arguments through the next part of my childhood, a lot of fighting, kind of leading towards my mom planning to file for divorce. However, right before she filed for divorce, she ended up finding out that she had lung cancer. Like I mentioned before, she smoked up to 2 packs a day. And when I was in 5th grade, she went in for surgery to have part of her lung removed. I remember the doctors thinking that her surgery was successful. And so, I'm 11 years old and we go through that, and I'm like, okay, cool. I can relax again because I'd already been through her earlier health scares. And she goes back to get checked again about a year later and finds out that the cancer had continued and was now actually in her lymph nodes and was spreading towards her brain. She ended up getting chemo, radiation as I went through 6th grade. And I remember eventually my mom made the decision to stop chemo and radiation because the doctors decided for quality of life over quantity of life. And what that ended up meaning is that she got to spend about the next year slowly dying. So there wasn't really any quality of life that granted her, although I do know that, chemo and radiation at that point wouldn't have done anything. I spent 6th and 7th grade kind of watching her mind deteriorate. It was similar to that of like dementia is how I would describe it. She ended up slowly forgetting how to drive. Then she started forgetting, who we were. She would have glimpses where she would remember who I was. And for the last maybe 6 months or so, she was bedridden. And she passed away spring break of my 7th grade. And I would say that, to be respectful, that my dad was not ready to be a single parent. And so I kind of spent the next years growing up kind of by myself. There just wasn't a lot of family cohesion at all after that. That was better for me than it was my younger brother because I was almost a teenager to where you want that independence anyway. But my brother was much younger, so I think it affected him a lot worse, the ages where that happened. Going back to why I think I wanted to be in law enforcement, I've always wanted to be a cop. And there's really no explanation behind it that I can think of. I have no law enforcement in my family. I would say that most of my extended family is not pro law enforcement. On one side, it's kind of the left ideology, anti-police, and on the other side, it's the right anti-government, anti-police ideology.
Yeah.
My mom was never a big fan of law enforcement. She did call the police a lot, but would talk badly about the police. My dad, though, he was, I would say he was a police supporter growing up. Not like a, back the blue flag guy, but he just didn't hate the police. So that's how I would describe it.
Yeah.
Going back to my mom a little bit. So, I've thought a lot about what was it about law enforcement that attracted me to it. And I go back to my mom and her history. And prior to my parents meeting, my mom had my older brother when she was 16 years old back in the 70s. She ended up moving in with a guy who was very physically abusive of her. And she was in a domestic violence, bad relationship for about 5 years before she decided to escape. And her way to escape was to hitchhike from Alaska. I don't remember which part of Alaska, to Seattle. And to put this in perspective, this was the mid 70s. My mom would have been 22 years old, blonde hair, blue-eyed, young female, jumping into strangers' cars with a 5-year-old. And this was before cell phones or surveillance cameras. I think
this is the heyday of when people would say not to do that thing, right?
Yeah. Yep. But she was trying to escape. She was trying to save my brother. And she alluded to some things that happened to her. But I was obviously young the whole time she was alive, so she didn't get too detailed into what happened to her. Um, Once she got to Seattle, she was essentially homeless, just kind of couch surfing, finding places to stay for my brother. You know, basically just trying to make ends meet every week, working odd jobs as she raises him. Uh, so because of that, looking back, I mean, she had severe PTSD. She had every bit of making of somebody that was vulnerable, and probably had a ton of bad stuff happen to her. And because of that, the way that she tried to fix that for me was from a very early age. I was very aware that there were bad guys around me. Even as a little kid, she would, pull me aside and tell me about these horrible things that could happen to me. These guys can kidnap you. She'd tell me about other kids that got, grabbed and molested or whatever. I just had this idea that like all of these horrible people were around me, and really at any moment with the wrong move, something horrible was going to happen to me. It was a good example of it is that, when me and my brother got old enough that we couldn't go in the women's restroom with her, we would go in the men's restroom, and she would have a panic attack every time. So if we were, say, at a public place, we're in the restroom, it's been a minute or two, she'd start screaming our names at the door. And if we didn't come out, she'd start like trying to fight her way in, and there'd be other dads and stuff trying to calm her down and be like, no, they're in here. They're okay. And she just, yeah. And then I think just because of how chaotic my upbringing was, I always saw the police as kind of the ones that would bring calmness to chaos. I just, with this idea that I had when I was a little kid, that there were all these bad guys around. Well, okay, well, who fixed that problem? The police. And, when things were really bad and there was a lot of chaos or something bad happening, who did everybody call? They called the police. And that, through a deep, like, psychological dive into myself, that's really the reason I think that I became interested in law enforcement.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So I didn't really take my wanting to be a cop seriously until I got older. Once I got out of high school, I started working some security jobs, doing loss prevention. And probably my early 20s is when I got really serious about it. I was already in college, but I wasn't taking it serious. I wasn't going to class. I just kind of, wasting my time. And then something happened and I just became like super motivated. And I'm like, you know what? I need to do what I need to do to make this happen, because if I don't, I'm not going to be able to be a police officer. And so, I continued my criminal justice courses. I wanted to move away from Seattle. So I ended up applying through a Western undergraduate exchange program and got into New Mexico State University for in-state tuition, which was kind of a random school to go to, but it allowed me to, not have to pay extra money and move somewhere completely different.
Yeah.
And once I was down there, I dived like full force into it. I wish I could just have like an ounce of the motivation I had at that time. I was doing everything. I was doing Big Brothers Big Sisters, multiple college organizations, and I did multiple internships while I was in college. Once a couple with the University Police Department there, and then another with the Luna County Sheriff's Office, which is a rural sheriff's office near the university I went to. And if you want, I can start talking about, the application process. I know I just kind of laid out a bunch of,
No, that's great. I do want to take a moment, kind of go back a little bit, because
sure, yeah, I know.
We talk so much about purpose and like what brings people in, especially me coming in from hiring. And by the way, you helped a ton when you're on light duty with background, so you know a little bit of the hiring game, the pros and cons and the headaches with that. But also the cool things, right? When you interact with these folks that are coming in with these big ideals, and a lot of your story, and I knew bits of it, and that I know more now, but it makes a lot of sense when I think about you. And in some ways, it's because you are so purposeful in what you do, right? Even when you said just now, like, you wish that you had the type of motivation that you did back then, I was like, I bet you still do. You just see it in a different way, right? Because
sure, you
do produce 110% at work, and it's not at the cost of your relationships at work, right? You're not just that, hey, we're here to work and get out of my way, right? Like, you have so many positive, healthy relationships at work, and at the same time, it's not at the expense of your family. Like, I know how focused and devoted you are towards your wife and kids. And like, that's such a big piece that we talk about on the show too, because I feel fortunate that I have the right circles, maybe some of the mistakes made, and we'll get there, that I've made early. And I'm glad I made a lot of my mistakes earlier before I became a dad.
Absolutely.
And this is,
absolutely.
yeah. And this is coming from my whole life. If there's one thing I wanted to do, it wasn't be a cop, but it was wanting to be a dad, because
Yep.
I have a terrible relationship with my dad. So when you talk about chaos, right? Like remembering this, I mean, we think about like early memories, and you don't remember a whole lot from your 3 and 4 year old age, right? So, but that you remembered it being chaotic says a lot of, you know, how prevailing that was for you to remember that. It kind of reminded me of like, it's not supposed to be about me, but just I'm sharing this with you.
Sure.
We're also just having this conversation, but like, you know, there were so many nights of just, you know, more nights than not at a certain age where it was just like screaming matches and broken dishes and things like that. Like, I don't speak a whole lot about, but it is why, going back to the recruiting game, and I say like, this is a really abnormal thing to want to sign up for, especially these days where scrutiny is high and the no-win scenarios seem more prevalent, but there's still so many people that are stepping up and staying in it. And this is no judgment for those that leave. Like, I'm always clear about that. Like, thank you for your time, and we'll keep doing what we need to do for as long as we're doing it for the next generation, those that come in. But like, it's just to say that although the odds can seem so insurmountable at times, or so dismal, or you get down on ourselves, we get down on each other, but like, that's how important this thing is. But you have this inner call, you know, this conditioning of like how you look at the world, where you're like, yeah, I know it's going to make things harder, my relationships harder, things like I'm going to have a lot of losses, but it's still worth it. Like, I'm still down to do it, because the reward of bringing order, like these things, like, you know, I did give myself chills when I said order when you were talking about it, because, you know, I was scared of the police as a kid, not because I was a bad kid, but because it's authority. And I was very respectful of authority, whether it came in the form of my mom spanking, or whether it came in the form of teachers or police, right? But I was intimidated. But like, ultimately, like, when you have so much chaos and uncertainty, all you want is something that's reliable and orderly. And I think that's probably why I have some hyper attentiveness to like details, and like a little, you know, some people may say I'm like a little OCD on certain things, and I'm smirking because like, people would definitely say that about you about certain things, right? And so I think that background informs a lot of what I know about you, or about like why you're so purpose driven.
Yeah. I mean, and kind of what you said, where, you know, you hated the police.
Well, I didn't hate the police.
Sorry, you said you were scared of the police. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Scared of the police.
I got yelled at for doing, you know, lighting off fireworks in middle school. So I was like, oh my gosh, like, I'm gonna get in trouble. But I was scared of my mom. I wasn't scared of the cop. I was scared of getting in trouble.
Oh no, I was
my mom. Yeah.
I wasn't scared of what my dad would do, but I was, yeah. I would say, you know, most of the interactions I had, even though they were, you know, small as a teenager, none of them were really great. It was just kind of a different time. You know, I grew up in the early 2000s. I don't know how the SROs were where you were, but the SROs where I were not the like buddy. I love, you know, I love students, and that's why I'm here. They were cops. I mean, they were there to enforce the law.
Yeah.
And I just, you know, I never had like great interactions with them. And I wasn't a horrible kid, but I wouldn't describe myself as a good kid either. I mean, you know, I got in trouble and stuff, and yeah, for whatever reason, I just still had that drive to want to be a cop, and I just never went away, no matter what. And it still hasn't gone away, even after, you know, 12 years and all the stuff that police have been through. It's just stuck with me. And that's why I think if you have it, I mean, you know, if you're thinking of applying or something, and you have that in you, that's what you want to do, you're never going to be happy until you do it, because there's not another job that I could imagine doing. So
I love that, man. And we'll take it right back to application, because something you said that stuck out to me too, whether it's from recruiting or whether it's like people I'm trying to help get into this job. And I know there's a lot of prospective, like, people that are coming into the space that listen to the show or follow along on social media, which is that earn it, right? Like pour everything into it. Like
Oh
no
yeah.
dragging your feet. There's people that are like, man, I just got to do this, or I need to be better about my fitness. Cool. Start today. Do
Yep.
5 push-ups. If that's all you can do 5 now, do 5 in the evening. And then we'll go from there. Right. And like how you're diving in, you're doing community service,
Yep.
not in, yeah, sure. It sounds great, but you know why it sounds great is because I know in hiring managers or admin or whoever is on the decision maker side of the table, they know that people that do community service, if you started just because you're like, I need a resume builder, you're gonna, unless you're a terrible person, you're gonna learn so much stuff, and you're gonna get so much like positive, experience back, like the connection with these kids or these communities or these folks that you're trying to help. Like you will just get that. It'll build you as a person, which means it's going to
Oh
build you
yeah.
to the top. So I love
Yeah.
that example of just diving in from every angle to make yourself the best candidate you can.
Well, for me, I mean, I how I want to say this. I probably had what I considered hurdles in getting hired as a police officer. And because of that, I wanted to do everything I could to make myself easily be able to get over those hurdles. And, you know, a lot of that was in school. I knew I couldn't just go to school and get the degree. I wanted to go to school and do well in the criminal justice programs.
Mm-hmm.
And my internships, I treated them like jobs. I worked hard to build good relationships. I wanted to make sure that, when I left there, those guys were all saying good things about me once I applied. And the community service thing, I mean, I just had this drive to do as much as I could at that time. Big Brothers Big Sisters, I mean, man, I think that's the most underrated community service organization there is. I had a little brother, and I'm still in touch with him to this day. He's now in the Marines. He's reenlisting in the Marines.
Nice.
He had all the makeups of, going the other way in life, and he's doing great. And if I even had the tiniest part of that, it was so rewarding. But you're right. I mean, I think that a lot of applicants don't look at it that way. They decide, oh, I want to be a cop. And so they start applying right then without any preparation. And then they're like, oh, here's my background. And okay, the way it is in law enforcement, most stuff can be overlooked. We look at the whole person from doing backgrounds and stuff. You just have to make it so that you can show who you are now compared to then.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's extremely important. And
Yeah.
a lot of people just don't do that preparation.
Yeah. And just a little bit more on the hiring side is there's probably countless number of people that are like, oh, okay, so that's a deal breaker right now. Okay, so I guess I'd apply in like 6 months or a year, or I'll apply to these agencies. I'm like, no, you're getting that. You're not getting it. It's not so much the thing, but like you can apply back in 6 months or a year, but really outside of time, nothing's changed, or outside of you not doing that thing again, nothing's changed with that mentality, right? Like rather than this thought, which I share that a lot. Whereas like what I hear from you is you wanted to prove all these potential negatives, right? Like how you've learned and how you've combated it, how you're actively developing past it to be a viable candidate. And I thought the same, right? Like getting hired as a 21-year-old, like I know that there's a lot of flags, and especially the amount of alcohol is around in college and all that stuff, right? Like it's very recent. So I need to demonstrate through my actions and my reflections, like why someone should look at it differently for me than just a 21-year-old that was in a frat, right?
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
So let's talk about continuing on from hiring, and then where did things start clicking and you started making that transition into your first agency?
Yeah. So I think this is important too, just to touch on, because I talked a lot about my childhood, and I kind of just talked about the negative parts of it. There, it was a balance, right? I definitely had good times. We had great holidays. We had some great vacations. And one thing that I think really helped me in this process was that my dad was always very supportive of me and my brother's interests, no matter what it was. It could be the least interesting thing to him in the world, and he like embraced it wholeheartedly. And so what that ended up doing is both me and my brother ended up pursuing things we were interested in. And so that's what made kind of what I'm talking about that I did in college so much easier, because I was doing something I was interested in. I wasn't like trying to be a doctor or something I have no interest in because that's what my parents forced me to try to be.
Guilty for 1/4. Yeah.
Yep. And yeah, so basically the way it worked for my application processes is I was nearing graduating college. Uh, I had met my now wife in New Mexico, and figured I was going to stay down there. Um, I kind of thought that it was going to be like Washington State, where at the time, this was back in 2012, you had to apply, 20, 25 places if you wanted to get hired. It was extremely competitive. So I applied all over the state. I ended up going to my first testing process, and I actually failed the 1.5 mile run. I think back then it was you had to do it in 12 minutes or something. And I was over that. So I failed that one. A couple weeks later, I went out to 2 other departments. Hiring process I passed, ended up doing interviews with them, and both of them gave me conditional offers. So I was able to drop kind of all the rest of my applications, which was cool. I ended up getting hired by the Carlsbad Police Department in New Mexico. Not a lot of people have heard of that city. It's in southeast New Mexico. And it's right in the heart of oil fields, so the Permian Basin area. And sorry, did you want to talk more about the application process itself, or?
Not really. Just more of like what law enforcement was like at the start for you.
Oh, sure. So, being a cop in southeast New Mexico in the oil field area in 2012, night and day different from what law enforcement is now in the Seattle area in 2024. Which, I mean, it's just crazy to think of how different it was.
Wild West.
Oh yeah, I mean, I would say it was an awesome city to work in. The town itself had a huge transient population of oil field workers. The big thing there was meth. So, I mean, there was almost no heroin. It was just meth. And it was almost like you couldn't go to a store or restaurant without seeing a worker who was under the influence of meth.
Oh,
That's how bad the meth problem was in that city. For me, I mean, I went through in New Mexico, you can do FTO prior to going to the academy. So I got hired, did my first 2 blocks of FTO, and then I went to the academy in New Mexico, which at that time was over 6 months long, and it was a live-in academy. So I was living there in Santa Fe Monday through Friday. And I'd drive back Friday night and come back early Sunday from like early January to mid-June. The way I got through that, I mean, I'm not the type to like to, as you know, take trips and leave home and leave the comforts of that.
I do know. I do know.
Yeah. The way that I got through that though is I just thought about what my goal was. I was so close. I was so close to really getting to be a police officer. And if somebody had come up to me at that time and said, "Hey, you're going to get through this. You're going to be a police officer. It's only going to last 6 months though." I would have been like, "Okay, cool. If that's what I'm getting, that's what I'm getting. Like, let me get that 6 months." And so I was able to get through the academy, graduated, got through FTO. And man, how would I describe it? It was almost like I was like an 8-year-old kid that got a wristband at an amusement park, and I got to ride as many rides as I wanted.
Unlimited, yeah.
Unlimited rides. Like, I just wanted to do as much police work as I could. And also because I was new, I wanted to learn as much as possible. There's a contrast in the way a lot of new officers are. I wanted to be the one in every call making mistakes. Like, I would be primary on every single call I was dispatched if people would let me.
Why do you think that is? Where do you think that comes from?
Well, for me at that time, I would say I'm pretty ADHD, and I just kind of a doer, and I'm not the type to sit back. And also, I wanted to learn. I don't know. I didn't want to be the guy sitting back. I've seen other people get hired as police officers, and it's almost like they signed up for the cool uniform and the car and the badge. And then they go to work and they sit in the station between calls and they do as little as possible and just hang out with their friends. Mm-hmm. And to me, I was like, why? This is such a cool job. Like, why are you guys just sitting here? Yeah. Even when there's no calls, there's still stuff that you could go do. At that time was kind of my perspective.
And just to follow up, I suppose, like for my curiosity and listeners, because I think that there is something right there where we already talked about how your mom was always worried about stuff. And, we've shared about like a degree of worrying about things. However, in this scenario, you want something so bad, you could see how others may want to sit back because they don't want to make mistakes. Maybe they do want to do the thing, they want to build confidence, but you see that a lot with student officers, with new cops, just not having the confidence to say, hey, I know I'm going to learn a lot through mistakes, and I'm going to learn through, like I'm going to grow through them. Rather, like, how do you, have you thought about why you kind of, I guess, metabolize it that way and move forward and be like, no, I'm gonna throw myself at it, rather than being like, oh, this is an opportunity where I could mess up and then have it taken away from me.
Yeah, and you are correct. That is the real reason. But when you asked me that question, I was answering as 24-year-old Sam, not as 36-year-old Sam answering that question, right?
Sure.
At the time, I didn't see it as these guys were worried about messing up. And I get that. Because, man, I mean, I was on a very senior crew of people, and if I screwed up, they were not gentle about it. I mean, they weren't nice about it.
No.
There was a video that actually went around where I was assaulted. I was headbutted by a guy, and it was because of a series of officer safety mistakes that I made. 100%. I mean, this guy would not have headbutted me if I wasn't standing there 2 inches from his face talking to him as he's screaming at us belligerently, right? Well, that video became a quote unquote training video that everybody got to watch and clown on me about. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you're another new person and you see that, you're like, oh my God, like, I don't want to be that guy.
Yeah.
Right?
The fewer calls you go on, the fewer mistakes you'll make.
Yeah. But for me, I think I just, like I said, I was finally doing what I wanted to do. And even if I was on a crew of people that, maybe they wanted to go to breakfast for 2-3 hours in the morning. To me, I was like, I want to go out and learn as much as I can. A good example is when I was on FTO, traffic stops were the one thing that just freaked me out. I have no idea why. I would respond to like gang shootings and stuff and be talking to gang members completely fine. Put me on a traffic stop with the normal citizen, and I was like shaking. I was like fumbling what I was doing. I was doing the wrong things. It just screwed me up. And so during that time, I avoided traffic stops on FTO. I didn't tell my trainer, hey, let's do more traffic stops. No, I'll do as few as possible. They made me do a couple more. I got fortunate that the 2 that I stopped were super compliant, gave them warnings, and that sufficed for my FTO, and I passed. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, when I got done with FTO, it wasn't that I was still, I was all of a sudden better with traffic stops. I knew that they still were intimidating me for whatever reason. And so what I did with maybe 3 nights on my own, working graveyards, I went out and I made as many traffic stops as I could by myself. And I did, it was crazy. They were so bad. Like I was jacked up. It was jacking up the people I was stopping.
Yeah, that's a thing.
But, yeah. But what ended up happening is I became comfortable with traffic stops. And by now I've done thousands and thousands of traffic stops. But had I never gone out and pushed myself, I would have never been comfortable with doing them. And I knew that traffic stops were part of being a proactive police officer, which is something that I always wanted to be. So I guess that's kind of the answer to the question. I knew that if I wanted to be the kind of officer that I envisioned myself being, then I had to do those things. I had to get out of my comfort zone.
Yeah.
The things that made me uncomfortable, I had to go out and do until they didn't make me uncomfortable anymore.
Yeah. I love that. Let's talk about, a little preview that you gave me was reflecting of the things you wanted to talk about. You wanted to talk about kind of your worst day and lessons learned from that.
Okay. Sure. So kind of switching gears, I guess talking more about the mental health stuff. You started a little bit before I did. And when I started in 2012, mental health was talked about, but it wasn't something that was actually like, it wasn't done practically. It wasn't a real thing. It was like an abstract idea that was talked about. And I always thought it was odd the way it was presented to us at that time. Like, you'd be in some training or the academy and some guy it would either be some therapist come on that's never been in law enforcement and you can't relate to, or some guy would come on and tell some outrageous story. Like, I was chasing a drunk driver in a pursuit and they crashed and As I run up to the other car, I pulled my own son out of the car, and I'll admit it, I have PTSD. And you're like, oh my God, like, of course this dude has PTSD.
Yeah.
But I mean, but that was the bar, right? That was the bar for being able to have any kind of reaction to trauma. And I always thought that was odd that they were presenting us this information and then they would present these really low statistics. Like, 8% of police officers will have some form of PTSD. At that time, I guess is what they thought. When I think that with the way the culture was with mental health, it's that 8% of people just couldn't take it anymore. But you certainly had tons of officers that, were 20 years on crashing their car drunk, or getting arrested, or having some horrible thing happen. And so that was kind of the culture that I came up in initially. And it's become really important to me, especially with all the new officers that we have, to try to help them not make some of the mistakes that I made and other people made when it came to dealing with the stressors of the job that we do. Especially working in a place like Kent. I mean, we're exposed to so much trauma, and it's just so important that we address those things and deal with them, especially for our new officers. And so for me, at this point in my career, as you know, I have been through at this point pretty much every kind of traumatic call that you could possibly be involved in. But kind of the worst night for me actually happened when I only had about 5 years on in law enforcement. And I'll talk about that and kind of all the things that I did wrong and that I should have done differently. So basically, because I think it was a Sunday night, I was working the West Hill on swings. And right as I'm leaving the station, we get a call of CPR. And generally CPR calls, you run code to them. It's usually somebody that's elderly or unhealthy. You might do CPR for a minute, and then fire comes and takes over. All that this call read was daughter calling in that mother was unconscious and not breathing. So my mind automatically goes to elderly mother, adult daughter calling in, which is the norm of that call.
Sure.
I run code up the hill, get to the apartment, go up to the door, knock on it. Door opens. First thing I see is a woman who's my age, very dead on the couch, probably had been dead for hours at that point. And an 11-year-old girl with tears in her eyes answers the door. Right away, it started to hit me at that call. I mean, that was the exact same age I was that my mom died. And there are just similarities to it. My mom died because of her, she had her issues and she had her vices, and that ultimately led to her death. And so I'm like, okay, let me go talk to this girl. I bring her to a back bedroom, and in the way that an 11-year-old would try to reason what's happening, she told me what had happened throughout the day. It really didn't make sense. It initially sounded almost like she was saying that her mom had died, maybe an overdose or something, and people had left the mom there with the daughter. I didn't really know what had happened at that point, but in talking to her, I started to become like overwhelmed with emotion. It was way, way too personal for me. I mean, the age of the mom, everything was a direct reminder of what happened to me when I was a kid. It was just a very personal call. Fire department came in. Thank God for them. They were awesome. They took the girl. They started dealing with her because, I didn't say anything, but I couldn't deal with that girl anymore because it was too personal.
Yeah.
And, this was before the big mental health push. So my partners show up, and who do you think took that call as primary? It was me. I didn't ask anybody else to take the call. It's my call. I was a primary officer. Yeah. So I took it. So they come, they leave. I start processing the scene. Roommate shows up of the deceased girl, and I'm talking to her. And it's almost like on the inside, it's like overwhelming. But in talking to her, I'm completely monotone. And I actually had to apologize to the roommate. I'm like, I'm sorry that I sound so like I don't care. And she goes, no, I understand. You're just doing your job. And in my head, I'm like, no, like if I cannot show emotion right now because it's too much. I got to shut down. So we ended up figuring out what actually happened. Mom had been using, I think it was Xanax the night before, and probably slowly overdosed over the course of the day until she died. And it just happened to be when the daughter was left with the mom. And so the medical examiner came, and fortunately, let me back up a little bit. First, her parents came to take the daughter. So I watched as that kind of pass off happened, where the grandparents took the daughter, and they seemed like great people, and that was reassuring. But that was also still very personal to me, watching this little girl, see her mom is now dead and she doesn't have a mom anymore. Still very personal to me and what happened to me. And Emmy comes, they're able to deal with the body. And I remember texting my wife what happened. And then later on, it had gotten pretty late and I'm still at that call. And I text my wife, hey, I don't think I'm okay. And I get no response back because normally my wife is asleep. She's not on her phone.
Yeah.
So anyway, I leave the call thinking, okay, cool. I'll just get through the rest of the shift. We end up going to some DUI call where some dude was like in his car, drinking in his driveway, playing rock music and like backing in and out of his driveway.
The worst. You already hate that guy. You're like, I don't want to.
Yeah, it's just a horrible neighbor.
Yeah.
Fortunately, best part of that is that State Patrol came out and took that DUI investigation from us.
Thank you, State.
So, yep.
Love you guys.
As we're on that call, we hear a bunch of gunshots coming from the west of us. We were like, okay, that's not super unusual to hear gunshots. So we radio out that, hey, we just heard a series of gunshots coming from the west of us. And then about a minute later, we get the tones for a drive-by shooting. That shooting was actually about 2 blocks from the lady dying. So in that same neighborhood that I had been to. We all run code. The trooper takes the DUI part. We all run code up to the house where the shooting was. It was a house where I was familiar with most of the people that live in the house because their activities that they participate in have led to me knowing most of the people in the house through my work, except for the victim of the shooting, who I didn't even know lived at the house because she wasn't involved in any criminal activity at all. We go in the house and out comes this young girl. I say young, but like a young adult female, who is pouring blood from her nose and her mouth and holding her neck. And she's terrified. And she comes up to me and asks me to hold her hand. And so I'm like, okay, yeah, I'll hold your hand. I'm holding her hand and I'm telling her, hey, you're going to be okay. You're talking, you're breathing, you're going to be okay, as I'm watching blood pouring out of the inside of her head. And in my mind, I'm like, I'm lying to this girl, but there's no better thing I can say than trying to reassure her, keep her calm.
Right.
I remember Brian Lewis actually coming in with his medical bag, ready to try to help. And the way the gunshot wound was, there was literally nothing we can do because she'd been shot in a way that there was no blood coming out of her neck. Later I found out she'd been shot into her neck and through her sinus on the inside. And so it was pouring out blood that way. She just kept asking me to hold her hand and telling me how scared she was. I did that until the medics came in and kind of swooped her away from me. As that's happening, the other people in the house are screaming at us not to search their house. Like, whoever this relative was to that woman did not care about her. He cared about us finding whatever was in his house and was just screaming at us. He was hammered drunk. Just was, not a good scene. Pretty normal scene, but I mean, that was right on top of the last call I had been on. And, I didn't know if that girl survived. And on a night that I really probably should have gone home after the first call, now I had that happen. Not only did I have that second very traumatic thing happen after that super personal call that I was on, but then I got mandated to stay late to work that shooting scene. So I was at work that night until 4:00 in the morning. Still very much thinking about the little girl and my own history and stuff that happened to me. And eventually I get off work and I'm driving home and I'm like, barely holding it together. Like, I'm like very upset. I should back up a little bit. I had multiple officers come to me and ask if I was okay. Hey, how are you doing? What do you think I said to every single one of those officers?
Fine.
Yeah, I'm good. No, I'm fine. It's not a big deal. Went home, tried to wake up my wife, or I should say I came in and said something to my wife at 4:30 in the morning, to which she was like, what? Like sounding even the slightest bit kind of like what, like annoyed just because she's getting woken up. Not angry at me or anything, but and that was it. I'm like, I get mad at her and I'm like, you don't even care about like what's going on. And I go to the kitchen and I'm like super upset. And, my wife ended up coming out and talking to me and we kind of talked through what happened. But I just wasn't okay for whatever reason. That series of calls, with it being so personal to me, was too much.
Yeah.
I needed time off. What I ended up doing was sleeping for about 4 hours and going back to shift the next day and finishing my work week out and then going home. So, we had always talked at the department about taking time off after you have some kind of traumatic call, or asking other people to, if you go to a call that's too personal for you, or you deal with something on a call and you need somebody else to take that call, ask. But the reality is that the culture that still existed at that time in law enforcement was you didn't want to be that guy.
Mm-hmm.
You did not want to be the guy that asked for help. You didn't want to be the guy that asked for time off. And that is what leads to, problems later on in your life. And just, because that stuff is still there. And so what I've tried to do, especially in the last year, is kind of be that example for the new officers. There's been 2 separate times this year where I've gone to very bad calls and asked for time off because of it. And I'm very vocal to other officers about the fact that I'm doing that and why. Because I want them to see that it's okay for them to do that. Yeah. Especially coming from a peer, that's somebody that, is out there with them, is out there being proactive, is out there doing what cops do. And then my hope is that if I make it okay, then hopefully I can have some of those officers not make the same mistakes that I did.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you sharing. And there's a lot of pieces I kind of want to highlight. But on what you just said, I think that's why I got so excited about our conversation, you being open to this. You're not like you haven't been on the peer support team forever. You're not just like, waving the flag around of like, hey, this matters just cause. Like, I appreciate so much of your arc and what you recognize that was helpful, not helpful, in your career. Now you're a veteran officer, and so you're paying it forward and you're raising this message because you have that tangible experience. And sometimes I think about how my message might be, it might be kind of dissolved with time, right? And so, especially by my role and rank, it's just different. And so I really appreciate there being others that are willing to take up the mantle from the ranks, but also, again, why I got so excited was because this is somebody that, your story, your insights, I think, are so valuable for people in and out of the region. Going back on some of the pieces that I want to kind of highlight for listeners to circle back on and maybe reflect on themselves or their teammates is that compartmentalization, right? In that earlier call you talked about where the roommate, the call that we revisit a couple times, but the roommate's like, hey, it's okay, you're just doing your job. And so she in that moment might be like, you go to a bunch of these, I don't hold it personally against you. And for you, you're like, I'm trying to hold together, lady. Like, you don't know how much this affects me. Yep. And I mean, I had a similar memory recently where we had this absolutely tragic kid that was killed, and he was just total should never have been targeted. He was not even like the robbery victim. Absolutely devastating. But talking to his sister who witnessed the whole thing, her shirt's covered in blood, and I'm trying to keep her at arm's distance, and I feel really bad about it. But at the same time, like, she has family members there, she's pacing around, and every part of me, I think, as a person wanted to like get closer and like offer her more support in whatever way, right? Like see if she wanted to talk. But ultimately, when I became concerned that as they're asking about the status of their, of her kid brother, and selfishly, I don't know if that's the right word, but I'll just explain it. People can think what they need to think. But I was concerned about her ability to give an interview with the detectives because nothing was going to be different, whether she knew at this moment or 5 minutes from now that her brother was deceased. Sure. And I was just trying to hold the scene together a little bit. And as more and more family arrived, I became concerned about how their emotions would kind of multiply. At the same time, I was also concerned that as more and more family arrived, maybe they went by the other scene and they learned something that I wasn't telling them. So I ended up telling them, pulling her and them aside, saying I was really sorry and giving them the news. And it was we have this memory with auditory and sometimes olfactory, like smell.
Yep.
Right.
Sure.
Like that,
Absolutely.
the sound of, their vocalization, their reaction was just so chilling and devastating, where in the moment I recognized that they had each other there to embrace and hold, but I was like, I need to walk away or I'm not going to keep it together. And maybe none of them or anyone really would expect me to need to keep it together. But it was just like my own memory and thoughts. And the reason why I'm sharing it is just to underline this thing where I'm sharing this and hoping that people, when they think or they feel themselves in a similar situation, like the best answer is what you are deciding to do in the moment. And you can unpack it later, right? Like like no judgment, and F anyone that does judge you for like breaking down and giving them a hug. At the same time, if you walk away because that's what you decide to do, like no judgment there either. And so that's kind of what he evoked in me, and like kind of you sharing that story on how you're very aware of it, and that's why you're being kind of curt and monotone.
I mean, I think that too, when you're at those calls. I mean, I could go back to similar examples like what you're talking about when I was brand new, and it's a car accident or something where a kid dies and two other kids are badly injured. And that same thing, state police comes in and lets the family know that the one kid died. And being in that room with that family, right? That's overwhelming. Like that's something you don't forget. And at this point in my career, I could probably list 50, 60, 70 times that I've been through things like that. But and it doesn't matter what the call is, you'll feel it on scene. You'll feel yourself being like, oh, man, this is too much. Or you'll be at a call and you won't have a reaction. And that's okay too. Either way is okay. But really, I think it's important that people are just honest with themselves and they don't feel that they have to just take everything that's thrown at them from this career.
Yeah.
Because it's about longevity, right? I mean, it's important to acknowledge those things. And even if that means just talking with somebody about that, talking with your wife about it, talking with a therapist about it, dealing with those things, it's better than what the outcome of not dealing with those things will be many years on.
Yeah. And that's a perfect transition to talking about, punching out and going home, like recognizing that you're at your emotional, the limit of your emotional bandwidth, and just taking a moment, right? Taking the bench for a moment, proverbially, right? Like just going home for the night. And it's something that I've debated about, since being a sergeant, certainly, but the difference between, or maybe the toggle of like, when do you kind of step in and say, hey, I hear that you're fine, I perceive this thing, or maybe just saying, hey man, like I've been through enough things that you may hate me for it, but I want to send you home, or I'm sending you home, based on X, Y, and Z. Maybe you don't even relay like X, Y, and Z, but I feel like that's so tough. Like I have thoughts to go from there on like how to better navigate it perhaps, or how to evaluate that. But I love the sharing of like, hey, if you're unsure or you're feeling like you should go home, just go home. Right.
Yeah.
And then what are your thoughts on that idea of like sending people home? There's a couple types of instances where we do it, very few, categorically, kind of like, OIS and, lethal force stuff. Outside of that, it's kind of like case by case. And I'm sure many agencies, probably most agencies, don't even have those, those structures built in.
I've heard of some smaller agencies that do send officers home anytime there's any kind of traumatic incident that happens. Obviously, working in the city of Kent, I mean, that's just, it's not feasible. I can't think of a shift that we've had that there's not been what someone could consider a, critical incident or traumatic incident that happened within the city during that shift in the last couple of years.
There's a few.
So violent.
They're sprinkled in.
Yeah, sprinkle. Yeah, the days where nothing
a week
happens.
For sure. Yeah, not like a handful of them in every single week.
It's hard because I also I mean, I can think of other calls that I went to that if I was to lay out what happened, you would think it would be a call where like, hey, every officer there should go home. I'll talk about one. I was very new, and I think this kind of also illustrates the difference in the way a veteran cop's mind works and reacts to things when they've seen so much stuff versus a brand new officer who's being hit with something shocking and their brain just doesn't know what to do with it. Back when I was working in New Mexico, we got a call of a drive-by shooting. And I was like maybe I would say maybe 2 to 3 weeks off of FTO at that time. Get a call of a drive-by shooting with a child shot at the shooting. I respond there with everybody else in the city because it's a smaller city. We'd have between 6 and maybe 5 to 7 officers working at a time for the city. I say small. I had that many. There's been times we ran with that in Kent, but so it's a smaller town of like 40,000 people.
Yeah, we're running
lean. Yeah. We get there, and in the front yard is, I think he was 10 years old, or I don't want to get his age wrong. He was a very young boy who had been shot in the chest and was agonal breathing. And I remember getting there and like me and the other new officer that got there were immediately like in shock. That's how I would describe my feeling to it, was like shock. Like, oh, this is like, I froze for a second. Like, oh man, this is crazy. Like, what am I looking at? Versus the reaction of the sergeant and the corporal who were on scene, who both had children, sons that same age at that time, who immediately jumped on this kid and started trying to save his life. And we're like, I mean, their reactions to this and probably what they were going through, completely different than me.
Yeah.
We had a separate sergeant come up and kind of say, hey guys, like, don't just stand there, go check the backyard. And that kind of snapped us back into like, okay, back into cop mode. We start doing our investigation. That I remember the officers that were working on the kid almost pleading on the radio for fire to step it up, for another officer who's working, who had some medical training, to step it up and get there as quick as they can. And just, I mean, it was horrible. And that kid ended up dying as they were doing CPR in front of, that kid did not make it. Mm-hmm. He passed away. I stayed and did the investigation where we were going down and like looking for video camera. I think it ended up being something where the kids were playing with a gun. It wasn't a drive-by shooting. It was kids playing with a handgun. I had no reaction to that. None whatsoever. I can't explain to you why. I wasn't upset the next day. I mean, all I could say is that maybe my brain just didn't know what to do with that at that time. So if I had been sent home and forced to go home at that time, it would have been pointless. Yeah. I was like, okay, why am I being sent home? Now, again, this was 10 years ago. Where do you think those cops with the kid the same age were that got mandated that night? Where do you think they were the next morning?
Yeah.
They were in briefing, all fucked up, asking about, hey, is there anything different we could have done? It was bad. Those guys went right back to work. Now those guys should have been forced to take time off, right? Retrospect. That being said, I mean, still to this day, I'll go to calls that people are coming up to me and being like, hey, like, are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I'm literally completely fine. Like, I don't know, just for whatever reason.
Yeah.
So it's hard. Like, that's a hard balance to do. I think that rather than the idea of forcing people to take time off, make them feel comfortable about actually talking about things and saying how they feel. You don't have to sit there and talk about your feelings. I don't think anybody would say I'm an emotional person. Or that I'll sit there and
you're a passionate person. I'm
a passionate person.
Yeah, there's alignment there.
Yeah. But I'm not like a touchy-feely, like emotional person, but I think it's at least, as cops do, to be able to talk about like, hey, that was messed up.
Yeah.
Wasn't it? Like, and kind of present it like that to an officer.
Mm-hmm.
That was messed up for me. And here's the reasons why that was a jacked up call, and see their response, engage it from there. Right.
Yeah.
And offer it. What would you think about taking tomorrow off? Gauge that reaction. Right. And I think that's a great way to be able to tell if that person needs time off. And I think that would be great if a supervisor took that upon themselves to say, oh, you know what? I want you to take tomorrow off.
Yeah. That's a great
but
example.
They should be part of that conversation, I guess, would be my answer to that.
That's a great example, because the last thing we want is resentment or, the pushing awayness, right? Where it's like, I'm here, I actually feel fine, and you're going to discard me. Like, and now I'm useless to you. And now, so like, that's a way to, grapple with like a complicated stigma of like, hey, we don't want you to have a stigma. So now we're potentially creating another one by forcing it. And how cops love to have anything mandated. And so I love how your response and example gave a lot of credence to like where I think that we have opportunity, which is to, outside of the official thing, the cultural thing is we build this destigmatization, this openness to talk about things, like how powerful it is for a senior officer to come, third on scene and be like, hey dude, you got a kid. Like, I really think you should go home. I would go home. Like, I had this call, like my kid's grown and I didn't do what you just did, dude. And like, not just that time, but like through the years or through the shift rotations, like you have these types of conversations, very, very low entry point, very casual, very just casual and caring, just being like, hey man, that really sucked. Right. Like, I think that that's one of the most simple, peer support type conversations is just to relay, like, that was really crappy. Like, I didn't sleep well on that call yet, that from last night. Just like to share that, like, you don't have to make a big thing about it. Just be like, yeah, it's in my head. And someone else to be like, yeah, me too. Like, how beneficial those little interactions can be.
And that's the only way to do it. Really, it's the only way, because if you go up to a cop and you say, hey, are you okay after that call? They are always going to say yes.
Yeah.
Unless they're like, yeah, maybe there's an example of someone's like on the verge of losing their mind or something. They're like, no, I'm not okay.
Yeah.
Really, they're all going to say I'm okay. Unless you present it that way, it's never going to work. And I think that was a huge issue with peer and wellness for officers, is that that's how we were presenting it.
Mm-hmm.
Like when I talked about my example of my worst night, everybody meaning well came up to me and said, hey, are you okay after that call? Well, yeah, I'm okay. I'm not going to sit there and say I'm not okay. I can handle it. Right.
And you could get through, like you could work the shift, you could work the next shift. And that's
and I did.
You can if you had to, but the thing is, like, we need to recognize, like, you don't have to. And
yes, exactly.
that's where I do want to give a plug for like some of the really healthy evolutions, I suppose, and adaptation that I've observed through the years. And it's not prevailing, right? I'm not trying to say like, oh, our region is so good. No, we have so much work to do.
Yes,
our PD has so much work to do, and it'll continue to have work to do, because there's a lot of stuff that we're not even talking about that I can only perceive that 3 to 5 years from now, some, MHPs and docs are going to be talking about it. We're going to be like, oh my gosh, like, I sound like a bonehead now. Go back in time.
Yeah.
Like, we have to have that mindset to be able to grow. But one thing is that I remember like years ago where he's not even a peer support guy, but just a senior officer in briefing, just very openly, they're talking about kind of a crappy call, and the dude's just like, hey, you young guys, raise your hands for anyone that has less than 2 years on. And then like half the guys did, or something like that, right? He's like, find a counselor now. I don't care how, like, I'm literally telling you, this isn't a conversation. Like, find someone now, because you're going through stuff and you're going to go through more stuff. And I wish I had a senior guy when I was 1 to 2 years on tell me, just find someone, talk to him. It's insurance covers it. Just do it. And so that when you have the hard time, you're like, oh yeah, that gal or that dude was pretty cool. I'm gonna dial him up. I'm gonna shoot him a line, see when they're free.
Yep.
And I love that, right? It wasn't for any, like, it wasn't from a management perspective. It wasn't, because he felt like he had to. It's just because he really cared, and it was an honest, like, organic feedback point. Another one is like when a group of guys was saying, hey, we think that we/you/Sarge, Sarge was there in that group, like, we think this person should go home. And I was like, I see it from my angle. I would think the same. Like, why don't you guys go talk to him? And then for that to be received well, it was very clear to me that they had the trust. They had, and they were not fat on bodies, right? Like, it was like they recognized they were all better as a team, and that person being the focus of that team, like, they were all going to be better if that person went home and had some decompression, just chilled, like, punch out for the day. And they were right. And like, I think that's so powerful when it's from the peer group, right? Like, again, not about peer support title or training or like assignment, but just the culture of the environment is just like, no, we are going to look out and have these conversations and guide people towards help and guide towards people to be supported and do what they need to do.
Yep. And like you said, I think the therapist thing, it's a huge part of it, right? Having a good culturally competent, which is the most important part of that, somebody that understands police work and the way we are and the way we talk. Having a therapist you can talk to about these traumatic calls. You know, if you injured your arm or something at work, and you slammed your arm and you start to have all these problems with your arm, and it starts, you're at home and your family's like, hey, your arm is really messed up, and you just kept saying, no, I'm fine, my arm's good, I'll get past it, I can still work with my arm the way it's messed up. Mm-hmm. Nobody would look at that person and say, wow, that's so tough of that person to not deal with their arm. They'd be like, what are you scared of? Why are you not seeing the doctor about your arm? Like,
they'd say you're an idiot.
Yeah, you're like, what are you? So they would think the opposite. They would think like, why are you so scared of talking to the doctor about this?
And you're being irresponsible. They'd actually like probably put that on there, like how you're being naive. You're being like inconsiderate to like, what about your family if you can't use your arm because you jack it up so bad from forcing it?
Exactly, and it's a great analogy for our brains and what we experience. These traumatic things that we see, if we take our, say your wife or somebody that that's just a normal everyday civilian, and have them go out to the store, and when they get to the store, they get there and they watch somebody die that's getting CPR in the parking lot, and then they're like, oh my god, I watched this person die. And then as they're leaving that, they drive around the corner and some woman runs up to them and goes, help me, help me, help me, my boyfriend just beat me up. And he's back there screaming at that person, F you, this and that.
Yeah.
And then after they, get rid of that situation, they go down the block and they see a shooting scene and they see somebody shot.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what effect do you think that would have on that person? What effect would that have on your wife, your brother, your normal civilian person? They would lose their mind. Mm-hmm. They would be out for weeks. They wouldn't be able to function. But that's every single day for us.
Yeah.
Putting on a uniform and a badge doesn't make us immune to those things. Those things still affect us. Obviously, we're able to handle them in a different way than other people. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing this job. But the reality is, it still has an effect on you. So, and I think doing, EMDR and talking to somebody is the way that you treat those things so that you don't have injuries later on.
Yeah. I think that example is so significant and it's very helpful. Like, outside of like someone in this frontline type of work, like an ER nurse, like more people than not, you think about your loved ones, like more people than not would shut down. Like they would have,
yes.
I don't want to label it like a break, but they'd be like, if they took a couple weeks off of work and kind of just sat at home and circled, like just kind of like regrouped, you would not label them. You'd be like, yeah, you went through, that's extremely traumatic. I'm so sorry you went through that. Meanwhile, we do it. And I think that, metaphors kind of like, we get callous to it for emotional survival, for self-protection, but also reps in time. Like it does blunt over time. Like it doesn't hit us the same way because we go through so many, but it's not to say we don't feel it. And I think that the metaphor I like, whether it's the callus on your hands from like, working tools or lifting weights or whatever, like the first couple times it bleeds and rips, but over time it builds up thicker. It's more durable. It doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Sometimes like calluses on my hands like hurt. Sometimes they still break. Or scar tissue is one, right? Like the scar tissue never goes away. The skin might be thicker, but it actually feels uncomfortable. Like any old injuries or cuts, like it actually feels really uncomfortable at times, or certain angles or certain pressures on it. So it's like a reminder that it's still there. It doesn't, no, you're not weak. It's not anything like that. It's just facts. Like we can't ignore it. We can't and shouldn't pretend it didn't happen.
Yep. And I think it's more important now than ever because, I mean, what these new guys are going through now, what we went through as new officers can't even compare. It's just crime is so much worse. People are attacking us more often. People are running from us and fighting us more often. It just doesn't compare. The things that these guys are seeing multiple times a week, we'd realistically, even in Kent, see maybe once a week. We'd go all night making traffic stops and maybe one car would take off from us. Now they can't do traffic stops without people taking off. It's just a different world that they're in. And so it's so important that new officers understand this stuff.
Yeah, I think about it a lot. And it's like, coming out of recruiting before this assignment, there's so many people that I have hired that have been through a significant incident. Some of them were going to homicides like on block 0, like they're right out of the academy. Yep. I'm like, hey, like I go to their graduation. I'm like, so great to have you. Like they're like, these very bright, promising, and they still are. And it's like, I'm so excited for them and to have them on the team. And then I can't help but to be like, holy cow, like, how are we taking care of you? And how are you taking care of you? How are you taking care of each other? And I think that while it could seem like a distraction for some to be like, okay, like, cool, you're going to keep talking about how dangerous it is. Like, what does that do? Well, my follow-up to that would be, you talk about it because it's the environment, and where we need to come above and beyond is like these support mechanisms so that you can build the resilience and you can stay in the saddle for as long as you so choose. And for the more traditional folks that probably aren't listening to this and won't, but if they're like, well, I was fine. One, I would argue a lot of you all were not fine, as evidenced by not just my perception, evidenced by your peers that are retiring. And some of you are coming on the show or coming on shows like this. A lot of retired cops are very involved in building community, sharing story, because they're like, no, you don't get to just rub some dirt on it. And they have a lot of lessons learned, a lot of regrets, and now good on them to be sharing that perspective, because it does affect you. It's not a generational thing outside of maybe communication styles, but we can learn from that too, right? It's like always been a thing, and with the reps and the amount of guns out there, the amount of felonious assault, like, it's a real thing.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, so Sam, we've covered a lot of ground, but I know that there's so much we want to leave listeners with and cover with tangible growth and outlook and mental health support and thoughts and tips. So this will be part 1, and listeners can stand by in a few days or a week's time for part 2.
Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.
Yeah, man.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.